cybersecurity with regards to actually payment industry and the overall banking industry. And just to give you a very, well, two quick introductions. First, about myself. I'm a professor at the École de Guerre Économique here in Paris. I'm also a contributor to the academic journal of the INSS, Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. I'm an advisor to PwC in France regards to cybersecurity. And I'm also a writer, which is something I always stress, because fiction writing for this type of new risk is always an interesting exercise to think about what is going to come forward. And the main, say, thrust for this track, having been at TRUSTECH, having had the chance to come at TRUSTECH last year, is actually coming from a realization that a lot of the discussion in the payment industry, in mobile payment and so forth, is still around what is the one main issue that needs to be set, which is fraud. But actually, when you come to think about the whole spectrum of risk with regards to cybersecurity, you may see that it goes a little bit beyond that issue of fraud, and that's some of the stuff that we'll have a chance to discuss today. Without further ado, I will take the chance to actually hold the mic to give my own little presentation about the whole topic. And then we'll move into other guests and experts, some from other countries such as Israel, some from the legal environment, and then also some additional technical expertise from startups, from engineers working for open standards organizations, and so forth, so that we may have a chance over the next 2 hours to cover a wide range of ideas, topics, things to think about and discuss around that issue of cybersecurity for the payment industry and for the banking world in general. Starting with my quick presentation, one thing which is very interesting to think about cybersecurity is how late we've started to really understand how important this topic is. When you look at, for example, the survey of top executives at the City of London, something which is run by the Bank of England every 6 months, it's only been, but for the last 2-3 years, that really top executives have identified cyber risk as indeed a key important risk ever for their own organization or as a whole for the whole banking industry. And when you look at actually the way top global leaders surveyed, say here at the World Economic Forum, think about that topic, say for the last 10 years, cybersecurity didn't really record as one of the top things. The key element here that you need to look on the slide is the purple squares. So the purple squares are the squares about cyber attacks and data fraud that is coming from cyber attacks. And basically 10 years ago, there are no purple squares. No one really cares about that topic. And then 5 years ago, all of a sudden, there's one purple squares, and it's a risk which is ranked the 5th. So it starts to record on the radar of people. And then it's really over the last 2-3 years, and frankly, really over the last this year, that cyber attacks and data fraud or theft have been recorded as top 3, top 4th risk by top leaders. And that actually, in a way, conveys some sort of a sea change about that issue. Why so? One way to think about the whole issue of cybersecurity, again, is to understand why we're talking now about that topic, and like 10 or 20 years or 30 years ago, it didn't record as an important issue, which is bizarre, because we've had computers for the last 60, 70 years. But actually, when you look at the importance of digital information which is being used in our communications, one to many to many, or in between us and in future and the past, the information which is recorded, it's only been but at the end of the 2000s that digital information really started to record as the main way to convey information. On that slide, you have the analysis made by researchers from University of Southern California of how much data is ever in digital, in 0 and 1, which is the language of cyberspace, or analogous, not in 0 and 1. And basically, you see that digital really started to crank up by the early 2000s with the spread of internet, and really by the end of the last decade, then digital became the main way to convey information basically for our species. And that explains why now we're starting to talk about that issue, because we have had this transformation back 10 years ago, that technical transformation, and then it took us another 5-10 years, so that turns into a both economic, but also a security issue. And that's why today it is a major security issue. And one way to understand that is also to check about the importance that you see in terms of e-commerce and all the different forms of e-commerce. The root of a TRUSTECH conference is basically the card industry. And as you see, still today, even if you look at one specific way of commerce, which is e-commerce, the card industry is still credit card, debit card. There are still important ways of making payments. But actually, as you move forward and you look, say, in 5 years from now, there's a very high chance that purely digital means, say, e-wallet, for example, are going to constitute the majority of all payment transfer which are being done online. And in terms even of the importance of e-commerce itself, which is indeed a way to accelerate that move into purely digital transaction means, overall, at the global level, between now and 5 years from now, we should move into 10% of e-commerce as total retail transaction to actually double 20%. And actually, in some regions, say Asia-Pacific, we may move from 15% today to 35% in only 5 years from now. So really, yes, as Marc Andreessen stated back in 2011, software is eating the world, and indeed, software and digital is fully eating this whole payment industry. And you can check that with a couple of main episodes that we've seen where actually payment or means of transfer have been really at the forefront of cyber attacks. Either the attacks against point of sales back in 2013, 2014 against main retailers such as Home Depot, such as Target, or even against the actual infrastructure of the payment system, the SWIFT infrastructure, which was attacked back in 2015, 2016 by attacks perhaps from North Korea. And then, if you took a wider view looking at the banking industry, say what happened with NotPetya back last year, where actually that malware, or rather wiper attack, managed to degrade the activities of 22 Ukrainian banks, but also activities back in France with banks like Auchan, which had also their own sorts of problems because of NotPetya, including in the retail payment system. And indeed, when you ask the question to bank executives, main clients for payment system, the main concern today is cybersecurity concern. That's the real heart of the battle. Now that we've set the stage for the importance of that cybersecurity issue for the banking industry and thus for the client of the banking industry, all the payment systems for the banking industry, let's look a bit about what type of risk we're dealing with. Because again, the key thing is that, especially in this type of conference, we talk a lot about fraud. And indeed, it's a big issue, and may I say, it's an issue that has not been destroyed. There's still a lot of things to be done, but somehow it's been managed. That's the key point. When you look, for example, at average annual fraud loss from Web Store, from 2007 to 2015, we've seen a decline. That threat is still existing, but in a way has been contained. If you look at e-commerce fraud losses in the UK for UK issued cards, you see that again, when you compare 10 years ago, we've seen a decline. It's ramping up a little bit still over the last 3-4 years, but in a way, it's been contained, it's been managed. So we still have a lot of work to do around that, but in a way, we can control it. The problem is that actually when you look at cybersecurity and you look at the three main dimensions of cybersecurity, the typical one, the CIA acronym, the confidentiality, integrity, availability parts, then actually when you look at fraud, in a way, you're only dealing but at some element of that spectrum, which is the integrity issue. And indeed, fraud, in a way, is a way to make you think things which are not existing, so indeed touching on the integrity. But there are other costs beyond the pure fraud effect, beyond the integrity. And that is all the indirect costs that may happen. The cost and reputation, which are very important, actually, and may actually have a larger economic impact on the banking clients. And of course, potentially all the systemic external risk that could happen, say, for the whole range of banks, if there are too many banks which are affected by that type of issue. And then, of course, you have also the issue around availability, which is a critical element in all payment systems. And mind you, many of the major cyber attacks started, in a way, with attacking the availability of payment systems. One of the first historical one around against Hansa Bank, the main Eastern bank in 2007, was a denial of service attack to stop the availability of access to Hansa Bank in a country, Estonia, where already at that time 95% of banking transactions were already done online back 10 years ago. And as I mentioned, we have had the whole sorts of examples of nation-state attacks actually against the availability of payment systems, of transfer systems. And mind you, the cost here can be quite high. Some figures from Gartner that would state that if your payment systems, your banking systems are offline, may cost you something ranging from $100,000 an hour up to a couple of $1 million if you are an online training system. Lloyd TSB actually had a problem with regards to the management of checking accounts back 2017, and the actual cost of that was around $200 million. And indeed, again, when you ask to a set of retail banking executive, what is the main thing that they're scared about is denial of service. It's the issue of availability. And then beyond that, you have also the stress point of maintaining confidentiality. And indeed, this is something which is stressed now with general data protection regulation in Europe. And you may lose from 2 to 4% of revenues as penalties if you unfortunately didn't do all the right things in terms of protecting confidentiality. But that's, again, a thing to think about, that this is one important dimension today in cybersecurity. Now, how much is at stake? What's the cost of that? And I'll go quickly on that last point, but that's an important thing because that's how much then you can ask people to protect them for that cost, for that issue. And that in itself is a big troublesome question, because if you look at the literature, you have figures all over the place. Some would say, well, data leak, it's going to cost about $4 million. Well, some of them would say, no, it's not going to cost $4 million. It's going to cost on average $200,000, which actually at the end of the day is not that much. Then you'll have other studies that say, no, well, actually, if there was a big cyber attack, it would cost you something in the magnitude of $100 billion. And frankly, if that would happen, that is such an important thing that no banks would really deal with that. That would go on the plate of a state, of a nation state. And indeed, when you look at stock prices, some previous data was not very conclusive as to how much was at stake. You look here at what happened with Target or JP Morgan, who were affected by a cyber attack. And when you look at stock prices for those two companies, after the next few days, where nothing much really changed. Okay. On top of that, you can try to do resiliency. That is, that's Equifax. So Equifax was at $142 stock price before they announced the big data lake last year. Then they did announce it, then went down 35%, but they did some of the right things, such as, for example, firing people. And they somehow managed to be back up. So that was in September. It was still not the price of Equifax back then, but it was getting close. Except that you lose confidence. And then if you have to announce financial results, which was not that great, not terrible, but not that great, then all the issues are going to pile up. And after announcing disappointing results, like EBITDA was, I believe, under 3% of what the street was expecting, well, then they had a shock, and they lost another 30%. So you see all those issues of confidence, and trust, which is absolutely central, and that makes actually the real cost for companies. So one thing that I try to do with PwC France is that we try to look at a wide range of incidents, about 30 incidents, from 2008 to 2017, and look in the long term, say over the next 12 months, who would be affected, who would not be affected. And we identified that actually there was nearly 2/3 of the incidents where we realized there had been a significant impact on stock prices, about a loss of 9% over the next 20 trading days, nearly 1 month after the announcement. And for some of those, about 40% of the guys in that sample, if you look over the next 12 months, then you are going to see that loss of confidence. They are going to lose on average 20% of stock price. That's a board event. That's where people are going to lose their posts and functions. But then for some of the guys who are going to do the right things, and we'll see some of the right things, then indeed they're going to go down, but after about 3 months, less than 3 months actually, they're going to rebound. And then we'll end up about 6% above stock price, the price of stock price before the announcement of the issue. That's interesting because when I look at much older studies, which have nothing to do with cyber, but which have to do with catastrophes, scandals, and loss of reputation, I found about the same results. That's a study from 2000 by Oxford researchers. And they identify that indeed you have the good guys, the good responder, and the bad responders. And the good responders, after 1 year, they're going to end up 7% of the stock price. The bad responder, are going to end up minus 50% compared to stock price before the announcement. So again, you see the impact, and you see two things. It depends on many factors. Of course, and that's a very major thing, the quality of the incident response. What makes you a good responder, what makes you a bad responder, but also lots of other different things. And one is the state of preparation regards to cyber risks. Of course, what we see also is that this threat, as I mentioned at the start, is better and better well known by people. And as time goes by, that's coming from another study, we see that the impact of cyber incidents increase on stock prices. And of course, it has also a lot to deal with your own business environment. If you are one payment processor among many other competitors, and you have to announce one big incident, and you have only but a couple of clients, then it's very easy for your main client to switch providers. And that's where you're going to lose a lot of money and lots of value. And I believe Global Payments had to announce back in 2009 a big data breach and lost something like 50% of stock price in the next coming weeks. Last point is that indeed, again, looking at the sensitivity per industry, our industry, the finance industry, the retail banking industry, is still today the one which is the most exposed to that risk, which, of course, makes lots of sense because at the end of the day, what we're dealing with beyond payment, it's 0 and 1. And this is very core to what we're doing. And last thing is that it's an issue which is important both for us as industry players. It's also, of course, an issue which is extremely important in terms of the conflictual dialogue between nation states, because we are indeed dealing with a very critical infrastructure. And that makes, again, what we are talking and dealing and discussing today both an issue in terms of private concern, but also, if I may, in terms of public concern, of how we can actually harden our financial retail payment critical infrastructure. So that gives you a very wide picture about the whole topic. And without further ado, I would like to call to the stage Ram Levy, Bruno Sangle-Ferrière from Marbeuf Conseil and Research. Monsieur Bruno Sangle-Ferrière has been involved in the financial service industry, working for Société Générale Capital Markets from 1990 to 2000 in Tokyo, Madrid, and London. You've left to set up Carousel Capital. The company was a registered investment manager until March 2016. You used to manage the Carousel Fund, the Carousel and other different type of funds. And now you invest in technology projects, right? And through Marbeuf Conseil and Research.
Absolutely, and we're actually developing a technology project, which is a device-to-device transfer system.
Fantastic.
And my presentation today would be about resilience to hacking. I mean, my predecessor on this stage has left you with a lot of examples of risk, and I will go as well, in fact, through some of these examples in my presentation. The thing is that cryptography has been there for at least since 500 before Christ, and hacking together with it. Press a button. Hacking can be implemented by terrorists, by foreign countries, and by mafia organizations. But the thing is that we shouldn't feel defeated, because I think they can be defeated. For instance, if you look at what happened with the card fraud, which has dramatically reduced with the use of chip-based cards. But the thing is that to understand what we are facing is that we need to be able to acknowledge that things we think are secure are not secure. And you will see that maybe in the presentation. In this presentation, we will review 8 domains where which people can get their grip on to hack into digital devices, and as well propose some solutions to these threats, and some mitigating strategies so that if the threat occurs, you can still survive, and your devices can still survive. So these are the 8 threats. The first one is a bit technical, third-party spy software. Again, I will review each of these ones separately. And the last one is really kind of straightforward, is unauthorized access to the device. First I will explain what is a third-party spy software. Well, it's quite easy to understand. It's a software that is put on your device or your computer, and which aim is, maybe it doesn't appear to be so, but it's primarily to access the data held or by your secure software. So the aim of this software, of this spy software, is to go and steal this data, which is supposed to be safe, or to change it to modify the behavior of your software. What can we do to avoid this issue? Well, a good one is not to allow any other software to run on your device. A second possibility is to use ring-fencing in your device, where your secure software is ring-fenced against such described attack from any other software. So that maybe solve the problem. You have another type of attack, which is a bit similar but different. It's called I call it software spoofing. This is where your software gets replaced with a very similar software, except it's not your software, but again, it's designed to change the behavior of your software, or to eventually to steal some private data. And the way it works is that somebody goes into your computer and makes you, for instance, upgrade with a different software, which is not the right software. So the solutions to that is to make sure only authorized software is allowed to replace your original software. Or another way, and this for instance is already used. I don't know if you in computers. It's sometimes called as TP, Trusted Platform Execution, which in older computers needs to be set to yes for this checking to happen. And another solution to fight these problems is to encrypt your data, your secure data, with the hash of the running software. Therefore, if the software gets changed, your secret data is no longer available. Of course, there may be some other ways, solutions for this, but these are two interesting ones. Now we are coming to another point, which is key breaking. So, key is used to encrypt data and to make things a secret. So really what you don't want is people to guess your key. That is what key breaking is. So how do keys get broken? Well, first you got the power of computers, which keeps on increasing. So what you thought was a safe key, 10 years later is not safe anymore, only a few years later. Then you've got people using supercomputers or farms of computers to pull together lots of computers, thousands of computers. Why not more? Well, but thousands is a good to go and furnish enough power to decrypt your keys. And then, then the interesting thing is the advance of quantum computers, which are designed, in fact, which are initially where the focus was put on these computers because they are able to decrypt any key, in fact, so in an instant. Solutions to these issues. Well, the first one is a mitigating solution. So you acknowledge that your key will be broken at some point. So you need to make sure that your system is not very vulnerable to hiding of a single few keys. So, for instance, don't trust the root of trust because there's a single key here or a single hash which will make the system collapse. Instead, use, for instance, keys assigned to each different device. And not so if a key is broken, you know that this device, connection with this device is broken, but not the whole system. What you need to do as well, I think, is to associate verification procedure to your system, especially if by luck you've implemented the first step, which is spread the different keys to every device, so that you can see what's happening and if a key gets broken, guessed or hacked, so that by monitoring it, maybe we're using a central server, you can go and disable the device or disable the information that is in it. Another way to go against this, because still this key breaking, though it may happen, especially depending on the keys you are using, it may require some time and computing power. So you only need to replace the key quite often, and therefore by the time your key is replaced, your key is guessed, it won't be used anymore. And of course, what you need to do is to upgrade your cryptography when the technology allows for it, and sometimes the regulations, because the regulations, there are some regulations on cryptography. It's quite funny to see that some countries are completely free, where you can bring any cryptographic tool you want in your country. Some countries are very restrictive, or you can't bring anything, and a lot of countries are in the middle, where you can bring some, but not any. Now, coming to a similar point, but which is also very, very important, is hash breaking. I'm not sure everybody knows what is a hash. So the hash is a summary of a hash of the data is a summary of the data, which is a lot shorter and allows to identify the data. So, for instance, you've got a 100 megabytes file, and then in the end you've got a 256 bits hash. That's a SHA-256. The hash, they are used for digital signatures. So what mostly people do for digital signatures is that they encrypt the hash. So by decrypting the digital signature, you get the hash. And by hashing the file, you get another hash. If the two match, you know that this file has been signed by the person who provided the key for decryption. That's what it is. So the main hashes which are used are MD5, SHA-1 and SHA-256. Now the concern is that MD5 was hacked. I mean, in 2004, SHA-1 in 2005, and SHA-256 is rumored to be hacked as well. So well done for the blockchain. So solutions to this problem. So same solutions as for key breaking. Do not make your device vulnerable to the single of any one hasher. So for instance, if you use, so you need to diversify the data so that when its hashes are different on every device you use, and this will help, especially if you use a SHA-256. You can use other security strategies, so it's the same as for key breaking. So monitoring for the guessing of the breaking of your hashes and disable the devices which have been replaced, which have been hacked. You can also ask for keys replace your information every so often, that when the hash is broken, it's no longer usable on your system. So these are the main solutions, some interesting solutions. Now it's a bit done for cryptography. We are more on the hardware style problems. So key breaking is the same keys we are speaking about, but you may be able to get your hands on them without using computer power to guess them. Yes, for instance, I mean, you could imagine that your device gets stolen by some laboratory with with very good scientific knowledge. What they do is usually that they lower the clock speed because then it's easier for them to listen to what's happening in the chip. And they use as well some microscopes to look at what is in the memory. And so they can retrieve eventually your keys. These are for complicated keys. So solutions is to keep the circulation of your keys. And what you may well do is just create devices from which keys cannot be extracted. For instance, with public key, private key systems. What you can do as well is, or you can do, I can extract the key, but only once, and just the time you put it on the other side of your system, and then after that, this function is physically disabled. What you can use, this is to avoid one form of this form. Another thing you can do is and this already exists, is to have some memory which gets erased automatically, I mean physically, as soon as people try to go into it physically. And of course, you can use the same defenses as for key breaking and hash breaking. So it's not only keys we are talking about when you have a physical device. It's the peripheral that you may be using with your keys, and it's quite interesting because the predecessor from Israel said about he replaced the keyboard and nobody noticed it. In a presentation, I've put replace because the device we're constructing will probably have a pin pad. Replace the pin pad, but be careful that the pin pad is not forecasting your pin code. So this is another type of attack would be where you have a sensor close to your device, which in fact is not really doing the work, where your sensor is meant to monitor some physical parameters such as temperature or pressure. In fact, it could just retransmit something that is broadcasted to it. So you need to be careful with that. So a solution to that problem is to only allow devices which are assembled with your peripherals which are assembled with your device on in the factory. Another solution is to get these devices, which you know are safe, to be registered with your within the system, so that when they are connected, you can identify them. I know some service providers already make this available. What can happen is as well, yes, peripheral and physical tampering is a bit the same. So you can spy on the keypad. You can spy on the microprocessor activity through radio signals or battery consumption, for instance. So the solutions are to make sure that your device you're using is easily recognizable, so that people who use it, they know that it's not a proper device. Like if they spot a little dog on the side of it, they are suspicious. And also, what you have to is better to separate the sensitive data from this device which holds, which may be hacked because of its peripherals, so that in case of any suspicion, you can replace it easily and cheaply. You can also build your microprocessor to reduce some activity if the clock speed is decreased. You can use some tampering methodologies if your device, though easily identifiable as genuine device, if this device has been modified, it ceases to work. For instance, by wrapping it into ink-conducting paper, and the tampering of this device getting to erase the sensitive data or to deactivate the device. So this is about sealing the device, really. Now this is the last solution. This is the last problem. Unauthorized access. So that's where your device is used by some people who are not authorized, despite all what you've done, PIN codes, biometrics. So what do you do with that? So you need to be able to, you can track its use from the moment it's been reported hacked, and if you know the time, it's better. Of course, you can call the police and give them the information you have. And another thing you can do is disable the device. Thank you. If you have any questions.
Thank you. Just one last thing, Bruno. So we've seen a wide range of different technical issues, from software to keys to peripherals to even access. What is the one thing that doesn't let you sleep at night? What is the one of all those threats? What is the one thing you really stress as we should be very careful about that and think about the solutions?
That is the last one is more important. This is quantum technologies. Quantum technologies allow you to compute solutions, the results of function on a universe of possibilities at once.
So a whole new range, right, of things to think about.
So it means that it's a bit of an opportunity for business because this is a real issue for all the cryptography. So you can, if your function is to decrypt a text into a message into a text, I'm not getting it. You can with quantum cryptography, you will be able to find the keys. So that is the main concern.
Okay. Well, another things to think about. Thanks a lot, Bruno. Ram, the floor is yours.
We don't have a lot of time after all this great introduction. You've mentioned something, and thank you very much, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. It's been a long travel from Tel Aviv to Madrid and to here, and unfortunately, I cannot stay until the end of the day. So as soon as I finish my talk, and we're going to have a little fire chat talk as part of this session, I will have to run. I do remember that you mentioned something in the beginning of your talk, that the importance of fictional writers to comprehend something as complex as cybersecurity. And I remember it was in 2010, I was back then a research fellow at the Tel Aviv University. And by the way, this is my dog. He's very sweet. And my professor came to me and he told me, look, the Prime Minister gave me a book to read because he wants us to think what we need to do to improve Israel's cybersecurity. It was 2010. And this book was written by Mr. Goldstein here. And it was about a cyber attack between nation states. And of course, this book was the foundation of the perceptual change that Israel needed in order to start moving very fast in cybersecurity, which I will touch in my presentation. So that's this anecdote is really, it's actually a reality. Over the years, especially in the last 5 or 6 years after I finished doing a lot of national policy work, I've been working with a lot of organizations in Israel and outside of Israel, from the financial systems to insurance to maritime to aerospace. And I always say that the more I know, the little I understand cybersecurity because of the complexity of the issue. And when Guy asked me to come and speak to you today, I actually decided to choose three issues I would like to discuss. One is the lack of understanding of cyber threats because we can't see them, because we can't touch them, and therefore our very low ability to translate this understanding to people who make decisions. They just don't understand what they have to make decisions on. And therefore, why we need to adopt a new approach of training and learning so people can slowly start to understand what it's all about. The second issue is how each environment is changing, and it's changing continuously, so we have to adopt ways to continuously change as well with the environment. What we've done today is not relevant tomorrow morning. There's a big difference between the old world of safety and the new world of cyber safety or cybersecurity, and therefore the need for layered defense. And then I will try to go very high up to how we create a cultural change. And a cultural change should come from the tone of the top. I will discuss briefly what we've done in Israel and how it impacted the banking systems or the banks and the banking system in Israel, and specifically what the banks are doing and the regulation that we have and how it fostered the change and what is done today. So it is very straightforward. Money doesn't look like this anymore today. Money maybe looks like this. It's in big server rooms that very few people really understand what's going on in those rooms. And hackers or robbers, they don't look like this. They maybe look like this. This is, of course, Rami Malek from Mr. Robot, or in his new version, is Freddie Mercury. But they can look regardless. They're people behind computers. But they can also look like this. And can anyone guess who's the hacker in this picture?
The baby?
Well, it's not the baby, but well, I gave you a hint. It's not the baby, but can you guess what's in the baby in the cradle? No. We did an exercise for one of our clients. He told us, look, we assume that the physical security, that there is a perimeter, and the perimeter is well defended. And we told him, look, let's challenge that. Let's see if the perimeter is well defended and add and throw in some cybersecurity issues. So we took a guy and we created a cover story. And in Tel Aviv, it's not a strange thing to see a man going with a cradle. Sometimes you see two men going with cradle. It's a very friendly gay lesbian city for the entire community of the world. So it's something that is pretty straightforward. This is Rothschild Boulevard, the main boulevard of Tel Aviv. So he comes into one of the branches, he goes in, and he sits down in one of the conference room, and as soon as someone doesn't look, he takes a computer. He just steals the computer from the company and goes out. So inside the cradle, there's a computer. Now you ask yourself, why does he need a computer? Well, the reason is because if you have the computer, then in about 30 minutes, you can take the administrative password of the computer. Once you have the administrative password of the computer, you can basically do whatever you want with the computer. You can check if there are files, and let me tell you something, there are always files on computers. And if you take a file from a very important room, like a conference room of management, there'll probably be the most important files of the company on that computer, because They need it locally. It doesn't work real quick. The CEO is very angry if it doesn't work when he gets into the room. You know, real-life problems. So then you get out all the files, and now when you have an administrative control on the endpoint, you can actually do with the endpoint whatever you want. So what do you do when you have an endpoint of a bank? You put a malware on it. And of course, the antivirus system will never know the malware because it's never been signed. So now, from this point on, you have a Trojan horse in the computer, and all you have to do is get it back in. Now, you don't even have to connect it to the wall because the technician will come and connect it to the wall for you because it has been disconnected. Why? Because people disconnect computers all the time. So you just put it back on the floor, and the second the cleaning lady or someone will come back, cleaning lady or cleaning man, someone will come back in, they'll just plug the computer back in, and they don't even know it's you. And now you have full control and access of an organization just by the fact that you've managed to steal a computer and take out the administrative password. Now, we made it easy for them, and we told them, look, we have a computer, we've dealt with the computer, this computer is wrong. Let's see how much time it will take for the security people to come to that room and understand that something is wrong and get it back up and report back to who? Not the security people, but the cybersecurity people. Those are usually two different people in the organization, right? We have the physical security people who have guns and they look like big shots. And we have the cybersecurity people who are geeks behind an office who usually, when they work in a bank, they've never seen the branches of their own bank because they don't leave the office. They don't know the reality. So we sent them, and guess what happened? They never found the computer. They didn't know who to report to. When they reported to, the report never went up because it didn't look like something that it's an anomaly. So basically, nothing really happened. The organization never found out that someone stole a computer and hacked them from inside and put something within the computer. And then we went on and, we said, let's do it in a branch, okay? Now branches in banks are adopting, are asking the customer to adopt digital banking. So what are they doing? They're bringing people to give the customers training in the branch, right? So you have a dedicated computer who's disconnected from the network. It's an internet that's only connected to not connected to the bank's computer, right? So clients can come in, they can get their username and password, and the branch will help them log in for the first time to the account, show them how to use the digital website of the bank, and from that point on, they will contact the branch less and less, right? This is how it works. So we came into one of those branches, and we took out the keyboard, and instead of the keyboard, we added a keylogger, so we can log every username and password that someone crunches in the computer. Now, why is that good? Because it's a very, very focused attack. Every person that will be using this computer will be using this computer to log into the bank. So within about 2-3 weeks, what are you going to have?
Sorry.
Thank you. What are you going to have? You're going to have a discon key with, let's say, 2,000 dedicated passwords of this specific bank, and no one will know where you got it from. The users gave it to you because that was part of the procedure. But that wasn't our main goal. Our main goal was not to see if we can get the username and password. Our goal was to see if anyone from the bank will understand that something is wrong. Someone is doing something with the computer and they're not supposed to do. So after half an hour, we've realized that no one is really aware of what we're doing. So we came to the lady who's responsible for the training and we told her, look, we noticed that someone tampered with the computer and they put a keylogger that looks pretty much like this. You cannot miss it. We actually wrote on it keylogger, so she knows it's a keylogger. And then she told us, yeah, it's a keylogger. It's something that's been used to connect the keyboard to the computer. It's a standard procedure. So then we tipped her, we told her, look, it's not a standard procedure. We are experts, we know. Call the security of the bank and tell them that something is wrong so they can come in, people. That was 1 year ago. I still did not get my keylogger back. We don't know where it is. It never got to the cybersecurity people. And the last example I want to give you, this is a picture from the attack on the port of Antwerp in 2011. What hackers did there, they actually had physical access to a computer, so they put a remote KVM. It's a keyboard, video, and monitor, so you can remotely control a computer. So we did exactly the same thing, but with one additional issue. We put a KVM, and then on the motorbike, again, you see the motorbike over there? We put an antenna so we can broadcast the signal very far away, so we're not close to the organization. And basically, we had full control of the computer, of the CEO of the organization for as long as we needed. Now we tipped the security people again. We told them, look, there's something in this room. There's someone touched this computer. Go in and see if you see that something is wrong. So they went in, they started looking, and what did they find? Why? Exactly why? They found nothing. Why? Because they didn't know what to look for. No one ever told them that a physical attack can look like something like this. There might be an antenna outside that is actually receiving all the connections. That even if there is a sticker of the organization on the box itself, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's part of the computer. They just don't know. And no one told them what to do. And because no one told them what to do, they don't even know what to look for. And when they don't know what to look for, they don't know how to report back. Now that led me to think quite heavily about this problem. Because as attackers, we know that this is, by the way, one of the most important talks I've ever heard from Rob Joyce, who's now the cybersecurity advisor for the National Security Council in the United States. He's a very smart guy. After the North Korea attack on Sony, he gave a very interesting talk in the conference called US NICS Enigma, and the title was Disrupting Nation States. Now, why would the commander of the tailored access operation of the NSA would give such a talk? Because the Americans understood that people need to understand the attacker's mindset. And what did he say? He said a few things. First, we, the NSA, we the attackers, we know the networks, or we know what you intended to use, and we know what is actually there. Why? Because they're looking for it. They're constantly looking. Whereas we defenders, we do something, and we believe that it's constant, it stays constant. This is not true. Everything changes all the time. You plug the computer, you put it back in. You change the software, you update the software. What was right yesterday is not right today. And that's what attackers know. They are looking exactly for that. Second, they put the time to know the network or the organization better than the people who designed it and better than the people who operate it. That's their incentive. They're looking for that hole. And then they're saying, if you really want to protect your network, you have to know your network. Sounds trivial, right? But what I find out is that most people, not only they don't know the network, they don't know the organization that they have to protect. They don't understand it. So if they don't understand it, they don't understand the network and they don't understand the components, how exactly are they going to protect it? And from the defender side, this is, by the way, was published on the Internet Engineering Task Force. It's RFC 949 about cybersecurity. What it said is that security is an art. Yeah? It's an art, it's not a science. You cannot follow a set of protocols because if you blindly do it, it will lead to a disaster. It's unique. It's unique to your organization. It's unique to your bank. It's unique to your insurance company. Every organization is different. No one can follow the same path because they're just different. They're different in culture, they're different in organization, and I will speak about it in a second. Therefore, the only thing significant that you can say about the security of a system or the enterprise is in the context of the application or the environment that you're in. Only in that context, in the context of the threats. The threats of an Israeli bank are completely different from the threat of a US bank. Because they're different, because they're small, because there are different regulations. They're just different. And by the way, this is why the best answer you can give to any security question is, it depends. It depends on the regulation, it depends on the architecture, it depends on the people, it depends on the skill, it depends on the threat. Everything depends. It has a context. And third, there are no technical solutions to management problems, but there are management solutions to technical problems. This is what cybersecurity is all about, giving a management solution to a technical problem that we've created because of the way computers are built. And if you look at the amount of problems that we have today, yes, banks are facing data breaches that are becoming not only for the purpose of money, but for the purpose of political and social motivations. Law enforcement is still lagging behind. Even if you call the police, who is going to come and investigate? I don't know how many of you have filed a complaint for a cyber breach in the police. Sometimes the police people, they don't even understand what you want from them. And if you don't have people within the cyber unit of the police, and Israel is a very small country, people know everyone, the case will never be dealt because the cops do not really understand what you want from them. They cannot touch it. They cannot feel it. There was no gun. Cyber threats are becoming more professional. We see more and more that, there are actually today, there are call centers for cyber attacks in the darknet. Who would imagine that? And no one can catch them. Why? Because law enforcement is lagging behind. We see that direct data privacy is becoming the new concern. Yes?
Yeah, so I think, I don't know if you hear me, I think you have a fantastic point here about the issue that it is an art, as you said it, and just one passing comment is that you've expressed why it is an art, and one of the reasons is that you're facing an enemy which is different to say national catastrophe or environmental catastrophe is an enemy which is very smart, and you need to move as the enemy moves also. Exactly. So the question is that how do you learn about art? How do you evolve yourself and be a better defender if it is indeed an art? How you become a better artist?
Well, that's a question to you. How do you become a writer?
Using imagination
and
liberty. And having the chance to fail each time I start to write something.
Exactly.
And boy, I do fail.
You become a writer by writing, and you become a defender by defending. You cannot become a defender by thinking about defense. You have to defend, and that's one of the things that I see all the time. Security people, they say the right words. They understand that it's all about risk management, and the security will fail. I don't know if Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize laureate, said that success equals work plus luck. And big success equals hard work and big luck. And in defense, resilience equals security plus luck, because you need to have luck. If someone is not attacking you, then you have luck. And good resilience, the resilience that brings you back after an attack, means good security and a lot of luck. Because if there is a devoted attacker, if there is an advanced persistent threat, they will get to you. There is no question about it. This is why it's not a question of when or if, it's a question of when you'll be attacked. And in the event that you will be attacked, the question of how quickly you will be able to respond and how quickly you'll be able to return to business as usual is about training. It's about practicing. It's about the culture of the organization that allows you first to fail.
Yes.
They accept the fact that you fail. And then you have good people that very quickly adapt to the situation and change in order to reduce the risk in real time.
Which is an issue because, as we discussed very briefly at the breakfast, people in security sometimes just want to offer and provide splendid protection, but actually, as you mentioned, we always fail, and actually we learn by failing.
Exactly, and that's my point. For security people, I always say, deep in their heart, they believe that what they're doing will create 100% security. They actually believe it. They say that they won't, but they believe that what we'll do will prevent all attacks. But it's not true. The only reason why they have prevented attacks is because either they've been good in their security and they had a lot of luck. But this luck is not always on your side. Luck can change. And here I want to go. I want to jump very high. The Israeli case, everybody's speaking about why Israel is such a leader in cybersecurity, and we are a leader in cybersecurity. We are second in the world in the number of startups after the United States. We have more cybersecurity professionals than any country in the world per capita, and in absolute numbers as well. We are good in security. I'm saying that with modesty because we're good and we have a lot of luck as well. But what you have to understand is that we haven't become good in the last 5 years. Israel has been doing cybersecurity since 2002. In 2002, the government has decided to create the National Information Security Agency, and they put it under the Secret Service. The reason why they put it under the Secret Service, one, it's because one of the few organizations that can keep a secret in Israel. Well, because people talk, and we wanted to keep a secret. Two, they're very operational. And three, you cannot really do good security without intelligence. And so you need to do it with an intelligence agency that actually understands the threats and can communicate them to the leaders in the organizations which you have to protect, and are civilian organizations. So for about 10 years, the National Information Security Agency was working with what we call critical infrastructure on how to protect their critical assets. For example, electricity, or the trains, or in some aspects the hospital, but not the financial system. Only the Bank of Israel, the central bank where the currency is being held, where the money is printed, that was under the protection of the National Information Security Agency. In 2010, this is where I met Guy, the Prime Minister understood that this is not enough. So he created a task force, which I had the great privilege of being the secretary of this task force, of 80 people, the brightest minds in Israel, all the relevant organizations from the military to the intelligence community, but basically, mainly, the private enterprises, because we wanted to speak to them. We wanted to understand how we will help them do better security. And the result of that was that we created an authority under the Prime Minister, which serves now. And this authority, what they do is they advise, first of all, they advise the Prime Minister on cybersecurity. We have an advisor in Israel to the Prime Minister who is directly under the Prime Minister. And like it or not, and it doesn't really matter if you like our Prime Minister or not, this is different, it's a political question. It's only because we had a very clear tone of the top that cybersecurity is important, that the government is going to invest in cybersecurity, that we are going to put the best people on special contracts, that we can compete with the high-tech industry in Israel in order to bring the brightest minds and create good security. Why? Because it's a very, very deep intellectual challenge. We still don't have the solutions to many of the problems that we face. And they have been working very hard, and now it's an authority of about 300 people, and they're guiding the different parts of the industry. But one of the most interesting changes happened in 2015. In 2015, the Inspector General of the banks in Israel had issued what we call the Directive 361. I think it's one of the most interesting directives I've ever seen in the private enterprise. Basically, what the central bank and the supervisor of the bank told all the Israeli banks, from now on, you have a responsibility to do proper cybersecurity. They actually didn't call it cybersecurity, they called it cyber defense. It's a directive for cyber defense management in the banking corporation. The first and most important thing is that they put the responsibility directly on the board of directors and the management. This means that now they have to make sure that security is done, it's measured, it's been treated as part of operational risk management. Banks know how to do risk management very well, but they didn't know how to do cyber risk management properly. So here comes the directive, a 28-page long directive in very clear and concise language in Hebrew and in English that told the banks what exactly they have to do. Now, a lot of people are against regulation, especially Republicans in the United States. Every time I'm speaking to Americans and I say the word regulation, they hate me automatically. But cybersecurity is an expense. Why would you want to spend money on something that doesn't bring you money back? The only reason why you spend money and the way to create a standard across an organization, or what we call an inter-organizational culture, is by creating good regulation that tells banks what to do, that forces them to put their hands in the pocket and spend millions of dollars every year on something that they don't really understand. Why? Because now they have to. The banks created something that's very unique. They told, the supervisor of the bank told every bank, you have to create a position, which is the Chief Cyber Defense Officer or Chief Cybersecurity Officer. It doesn't matter. But he has to report directly to the management. He has to be only second to the CEO. Imagine how senior he has to be. In some organizations that I work with, sometimes the Chief Information Security Officer is 5 to the CEO. He has no voice. He cannot do anything. The supervision of the banks told the banks that they have to put someone who's senior and has to be second to the CEO without conflict of interest. You all know it from GDPR, right? I have 2 minutes? That's a lot of time. I can hack a bank in 2 minutes. In GDPR, there's the role of the DPO, right? But he doesn't have any force. The only force that he has is that he reports directly to the management without conflict of interest. And by the way, a lot of organizations do the mistake. They make the CISO the DPO and they put him in a conflict of interest. Every CISO has to create an action plan which has to be approved by the board of directors. So now they have to speak the cybersecurity language. Why? Because they have to approve something that they don't understand. So they want to know more about security. They want us to come and tell them, tell me about security. Tell me what it is. Tell me the words. Tell me what it means. Tell me what it means containment. What are the 5 steps of recovering from an attack? Because they want to challenge, right? Their role is to challenge the security people and the IT people, and that's what they do. And then they introduce concepts like proactive security, process view, the human factor. How do you deal with the human factor? Every bank in Israel now, they have to do training. They do simulations for the management every year. Why? Because that's the only way to know that the people are actually ready or not. And one of the key factors is that they differentiated between a policy, which we all know what it's about, and a strategy. The reason why banks have a strategy is because it has to be unique, and it actually directs the efforts of the organizations to what they have to do. Now, in order to do a good strategy, we have created for some of the banks what we call the threat profiling or the planning cycle. I'll just steal one more minute. The reason is because banks have endless numbers of threats. They cannot deal with everyone. It's impossible. If the banks will have to deal with every threat that they have, they will become a security organization dealing with threats all the time. They have to deal with the threats that actually the real threats that are relevant to them. And the question is, what is relevant? So we introduced for them a concept from the IDF. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, have the same issue. We have a lot of threats, and we have to choose which threats we deal with. Why? Because by making this decision, we actually make a decision on money. Where we put the money, right? Because if you choose to deal with a threat, you have to spend money on it. If you choose not to deal with it, then you understand that it's a low risk, and you don't spend money on it. So the first thing we do is like we do in the Israeli airports. We don't check everyone, we profile. We decide which are the big threats, and we focus the entire efforts of the organization on that threats. If we decide that this year the threat is physical security, then everyone will know physical security. If next year we'll decide that the threat is cryptocurrencies, everybody will have to know cryptocurrencies. We profile. And then from the profiling, you create a strategy, because the strategy is actually focusing the efforts of the organizations based on the profiling that you've made. So profiling is unique. That's what creates a uniqueness. And then they understand, because we profile it based on the profile of the bank, not based on a general profile of a general bank. And once you have a strategy, and people understand, the board of directors can read it because it has to be in their language. If it's in a technical language, then they cannot read it. It's irrelevant for them automatically. Then we create a policy in the work plan, which is basically stands on the pillars of a good profiling and good planning of the profile. So this is my last slide. To summarize, what I want to say is two things. First, we have created in cyberspace a situation where it's almost impossible to protect. This is why I chose to bring the Belvedere of MC Escher, because for me it represents the paradox of protecting something that is almost impossible to protect, but we still have to protect it. We have no choice until we will be able to conceptualize something new. And then always keep in mind, yes, and be forgiving, because sometimes things will happen. Sometimes the protection will fail. And in that situation, it's not who's to blame, but who will rise up and create the best solution for the organization. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot, Ram, for rising up to the challenge and to bring this very, very fascinating view from Israel in large part, and from your experience to do also. The right introductory word. So Christophe is actually a partner at Simon Simons. He's been a partner for the last 17 years at Simon Simons, a law firm with offices in France, where he has acquired a wealth of experience in regulation, transactions, especially in networks, IT, internet, data protection, fintech, and the payment systems in Europe and Middle East, Africa. But also, I think you've been working with North American clients, as I understand. Christophe is partly involved in assisting companies, including financial institutions, and funds on data, cybersecurity, but also blockchain and artificial intelligence with respect to contractual, transaction, intellectual property, and litigation matters. And you're also a lecturer in the Masters in Law degree, Space Activity and Telecommunication at the University of Paris 11 Saclay. So great to have you here, Christophe, and delighted to have another view on the issue of cybersecurity, which will deal more with the legal, as I understand, and regulatory aspects of cybersecurity.
Thank you very much, Guy Philippe. So yes, I will try not to be boring as a lawyer here, but just to explain the context, because as you may be aware of, we have a big event or a big shock this year with the GDPR, which is definitely a regulation. So meaning that we have, and now we have a standard in Europe. I travel a lot, as you mentioned, and I was in Africa last week, and to companies to explain how the European and the international standards can imply and also affect the international business. And in this respect, cybersecurity is also part of the GDPR, of the also what we call NIS directive, meaning a network information and security directive. So I will try to summarize and also to explain how it can impact and how it should be considered, also in a very practical manner, because all of you works in companies, and how to also convey the message to the legal team if necessary. So first of all, just a big picture of also to explain where we come from, the old world to the new one. So we have, and you are more than aware of how it works, previously with the bank systems, the customer interfaces and the customer segments, and all the internal, external, etc. And suddenly comes around what we call the fintechs, which covers a lot of different actors, and also which is really disruptive. But at the end, even in law, we try to adapt facts to a regulatory and a legal system appropriate. And we, as lawyer and as legislators, exactly the same. They do not want to have empty area. So, but we have to adapt to this new concept, and which will also explain how fintechs, who are definitely in the middle of the new challenges, shall also be understood, or also be covered by the data regulation and the cybersecurity regulations. You have also new actors in these ecosystems, because even for the banks, we have even now some applications and apps and API, which are proprietary API, and progressively what we can see on also with what we call the Payment Service Directive, which also allows that one API be able also and give access to any and all accounts and bank accounts you can have in other banks, means that progressively we have also a new type of applications, meaning that there are also new challenges in terms of because these APIs will also come from third parties, meaning that there could be some breaches and some open systems where definitely the data and the related regulation should properly addressed in this respect. There is also the payment initiation service provider, where you can see that there are also different actors, meaning that they are, from a legal standpoint, parties, and those parties are the customer, the merchants, and also the different banks which also interact with the system. So there is a big issue here, which is authentications, and also the flow of the money, where the money is, who is the owner, who has transferred what, where, if there is any breach, who is responsible, who is liable for this transaction and for this flow. So this is exactly the picture which is the reality, and this is exactly where we have, as a legal standpoint, to consider to put the appropriate system and appropriate protective, meaning also, in any case, that we are in an innovative area. So the regulation is not here to prevent and to stop anything. It's just, on the contrary, to allow and to give a secure environment. Just some quotes I have seen recently, which are interesting. It's for KPMG, it's competitors. But it's just to say that, especially with respect to the bank and the payment industry, that it's not new. All these changes are not new, and we're pretty well aware of that. And that now there are progressively what we call data-centric cyber security attention and architectures. And probably that the banks and the payment system are also the most mature industry from a cyber security perspective. So again, this is not new. This is just sometimes disruptive, and has also to be addressed properly. What are the most common categories of cyber attacks? And again, I will not repeat what has been said previously, and better than I can do. But it's just what we have to keep in mind, even from a legal and a regulatory perspective, not only on the local market, of course, but also on the European side and the international side. Because what is a great challenge also for us and for all the legal perspective is that, of course, this data transaction and all the payment transactions are not domestic. Strictly speaking, it's really greater and broader than that, meaning that you have also a combination of different rules and a need for international standards, international rules. We have progressively, of course, a European standardization, a European framework which is building up progressively, but there is also a difference of systems. But most of the time, where all the organizations are really focusing at the moment are this type of from ransom, phishing, massive personal data thefts, and as also you mentioned, a big one is the false SWIFT transfers, because there are major breaches in this respect, and also definitely SWIFT means international transfer, meaning that when you consider that in any organization, you have to be very careful of the different regulation applicable, not only to be aware of, but also to react rapidly. And there was also a slide before you mentioned, which is also very important, is that what are also the police, appropriate police and appropriate police system, which are able also to interact and also to react rapidly when such event occurs. And just again, some very interesting figures here about the feeling and the trend. I think that, as you mentioned also in your presentation, I think that everybody now is fully aware of that. Probably it was not the case before NotPetya and all what we have seen in June 17. And now it's really important also to see all the thefts, all the big amounts, and also all the cumulative investments in payments in tech startups. It's very impressive to see that also there is a shift also from the traditional banking to the new banking systems, meaning that also new actors, third parties, interaction. So all these areas is really important to see that also probably there is also a conscious progressively from the different parties, not only the banks, but also the customers, about the sensitivity of that matter. And also don't forget that with respect to the GDPR, you will have a lot of exposure also from end customers, group of end customers, and also the fact that the data protection authorities will really and definitely focus on that. Yesterday there was an article in a French newspaper about the president of French CNIL, which is the French Data Protection Authority, and she said we were in a tolerant period, it's over. Meaning that definitely they will focus about all these phishing and all these matters, which not only are liable, you are not only liable when you make any breach, but also when you are also victims from a breach, because you have to, and that was also presented before, to set up a specific program, specific education, including in your systems, and also to interact with the information systems, so that in case of control, you can also prove that everything has been done properly to react and to do the best you can to avoid any such breach. This is exactly what you have also to keep in mind about the different instruments we have. You have heard about the GDPR. There is a very important things in the GDPR. If there is one thing to put the focus on, is really the management of what we call a breach of data. Because probably this will be here that you will be a victim of a breach, and that you have also to be compelled to follow some rules which are very important. Means we have, for example, to notify without undue delay, and where feasible no later than 72 hours after having become aware of it. You have to notify to the CNIL or to the appropriate data protection authorities. And in some cases where the personal data breach is likely to result in a higher risk to the rights of freedoms of natural person, you have also to inform the person consent. And the sanctions are very high. And I just read 1 hour ago that Google was seriously sanctioned by both the Dutch and the UK data protection authority yesterday or the day before for some millions of euros, just because they did not really notify properly the breaches that happened on due to their fault on their networks.
But so far, no one has been fined by the 4% sales maximum
4%,
regulation.
but it's about millions. Meaning that the sanction can be really important. So it's for Google, of course, it's different, but any and all activities can be concerned. I have a case in mind last week about a client, and they didn't make the good notification, and they feel that it was not necessary to notify, but instead they informed the clients, but it was exactly the opposite of what they should have done, because of course it shifts from an information to clients to a lot of commercial issue and criminal issues, because people said, well, if there is this breach, it means that a lot of competitors have all the information and you had a commercial agreement to provide confidentiality. So there is an escalation. So meaning from a pure data protection issue for data, for personal, for individuals, you move to a real and material issue, a commercial issue with a lot of difficult issues to manage afterwards. There is also the NES directive, which is for especially for network and information security matters, which has been implemented. Just a thing, the difference between a regulation, GDPR, and a directive under European laws is that when you have a regulation, wherever you are, even, for example, in France, the French government, the French parliament decided to adopt a rule which would be different, it doesn't apply, and the regulation should supersede any contradictory provisions. With the NIS directive, we have a slight difference, because this is a directive, meaning that the parliaments and the local authorities shall keep in mind the rules, but shall adopt according to their own instruments the way to reflect what is provided there. Meaning, in any case, that from a jurisdiction to another one, the rules will be different. So we have also some concerns here, meaning that's because in terms of exposure, because from one country to another one, the rules can be slightly different. So in terms of management of the cyber risk, there is an issue here, and you have to be very careful about that. And again, there is some obligation to notify some incidents. For example, with the NIS directive, incidents having a significant impact on the continuity of the essential services provided. Because the NIS directive created a new category of what we call actors of essential services. It means that when there are some, for example, you provide some services which can be necessary for the continuity of the state, for continuity of communications, for example, like operators like Google and the others, if at some point they are destroyed or they can't work anymore, this is a big issue, and they fall within the definition of operators of essential services, meaning that they have some obligations in return to notify to the proper authorities. We have also the PSD directive I referred to before, which is the Payment Service Directive. I don't know if you are aware of it, but it's really important in this industry because, of course, there are also new actors who are coming into the payments industries. And there are also some very important requirements from these actors, especially in case of major operational or security incidents. So you can see, and I will not have the time to detail everything, but you can see that there are some very important liabilities now from different instruments to keep in mind, and that from a jurisdiction to another one, even though we have some regulation like the GDPR, for the others, it's really local, and to be really keep in mind very carefully. There are also standards which are from the industries this time, like, for example, the regulatory technical standards, which will be applicable in 1 year, and which has been issued by the European Banking Authority and European Central Bank, and it imposes data security measures such as strong customer authentication using two of the following, so knowledge, password, PIN, or possession, key materials such ID, inherence, plus a dynamic authentication code for remote transactions. And there will be some sanctions which will be provided by the PST directive. The same for the PCI DDoS. You have also very strong requirements. The same for customer security program within the SWIFT program, and also what we call FIDO, functional certification program. So you can see that it's not European and it's not local, but there are a lot of different other industries and standards that will apply with sanction if not followed. Again, what we have a third thing, it's important, what I call soft law. It means that it's more other regulation or guidelines. So meaning that there is no real sanction, but in some cases it will be, of course, taken into consideration if it is not fully complied with, especially when you are an actor of the sector and when you are supposed to follow the guidelines from those different entities, especially, for example, in France with the ACPR and ANSI or the European Banking Authority. It shall be very taken seriously to consideration. We have also new regulations against cyber criminality. For example, in France, as far as France is concerned, we have what we call the Military Plan Act, so which is also implemented in especially in our criminal code. So there are new powers, for example, which have been granted to electronic communications operators to scan the networks and to detect clues for a possible future attack, not only for their own to detect, but also to notify again to the Cybersecurity agency in France, ANSSI, those breaches or potential breaches, as well as the traces that they have to notify. And we have also some pending and coming European level new instruments, which are again important because again those threats are not only local issues. Great. I will make just a brief focus on the GDPR because it was a very hot topic this year. Again, this is not new, but it's important because all the principles of the GDPR, like privacy by design, privacy by default, etc., have already been integrated within the banking industry, but should also become now progressively standard. And when I said last week in Africa that probably the GDPR is not ideal, but it's a standard, it's not the golden standard, I would say, but it's a standard, meaning that I think you will learn more progressively that a lot of people will refer to privacy by design, privacy by default, notification, etc., because this is the standard that shall apply and which will be copied for a lot of different instruments. So there is also interaction between the GDPR and the NIS directive, which say that in any case, the GDPR will be taken into consideration. Why I say that? It's because important, because for most of the time we say, okay, it's just data from individuals, but it also directly impacts the business. So it's very important to see that progressively, unfortunately, all these different instruments progressively converge. We have the same with the PSD directive, which says that we can, especially when you collect data for banking purposes, you will automatically have personal information. How to combine both, how to make profiling, for example, but at the same time you have to comply with the rules applicable under the GDPR. And as you can see, with the 2% or the 4% of sanction, it's very important. So as you can see, again, all these different instruments are really interconnected and are really and shall be considered really seriously from one to another one. Cybersecurity management, I think that we have already discussed that, but just from a legal perspective, which is not with a legal instrument, but how to manage that, it's to make policy and risk mapping, serious control and audits, investigation and sanction. Keep that in mind when you are reviewing, for example, a specific plan or contracts. Another thing which is important, what are the contractual measures to prevent cyber attacks? I think that from, for example, a contractual approach, it's very important to take into consideration the cyber risk in each contract at the contracting stage. I mean, integrating at the beginning the cyber risk in the deal negotiation, drafting the associated provision in terms of liability, insurance, security, etc. And of course, a verification of all the suppliers' agreement, upstream and downstream market. But very important to also consider all the information coming from your suppliers, because you can be liable in case of breach. And for example, for SaaS contracts, important also in that case, because this is typically about what we've said, how to anticipate data loss, how to anticipate data breach. So always keep in mind, always have the good visibility, and for example, for SaaS and loss, what are the backup? Probably the backup is also important, even if it's in within a SaaS contracts, to have a backup probably outside or in-house. Investigation, so that's and what is very important, I think, to consider is to set up a very specific crisis management process. Now with the GDPR and the other instruments, we'll have a post-control, so in case of investigation, you have to prove that you did your best, that you have implemented measures, that everybody has been trained, and that's very important to have training personnel and also have crisis processes. And I would just want to finish with that, because I think that the most complex challenge, even if it's not totally legal, it's also a human factor. And as we said, generally, be careful when we are in cyber to do not the opposite as what we will do in the real world. And especially, this is in French, but they say that you will never deliver your credit card if you don't know who is on the other side. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Christophe. And I'm sure this is going to be one of the reference talk because I've seen so many people actually taking picture of your screen, as I believe actually you can also have that from the TRUSTECH system. But really fascinating view of the whole legal landscape and regulation with which to work. So Ian is the head of cyber strategy for EME at Biocatch. It's a US-Israeli cybersecurity company founded in 2011 that uses biometrics for fraud prevention and detection. Ian has spent 14 years specializing in cybercrime prevention, initially with the Royal Bank of Scotland, where he created the Cyber Intelligence Unit, before moving to run the technical aspects of cybercrime prevention. And now you are heading Biocatch, and you're head of, as I said, cyber strategy for EMEA for Biocatch. So the floor is yours for the next 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. Just checking this is working. It's quite good that we had the previous presentations that went through. They covered some of the stuff I'm going to touch on. Yeah, it's a bit of a cheesy title, I admit that. It's something I did as a webinar earlier on this year when we need something that's catchy. But actually, it is topical. When we consider what's actually going on, I've lost it. I even had it in the fonts from the Fast and the Furious on the original slide. But we consider the payment evolution. We've gone to the fact that regulation is now saying, right, 10-second payments. The fraudsters are going, hey, I can get the money out in 10 seconds. For those of us who are actually dealing at the sharp end of this, where we'll go, well, I've got to get the fraud control. What am I going to do here on authentication, risk management? How am I going to feed it in? It's a lot more complex problem on that. Don't need to know that, I'm ugly. Talking about the fraud here, but we've got the stuff I'm talking about, I'm concentrating on the banking sector, which is my background. I've had about 20 years in the banking sector. Fraud is probably the most obvious aspect of any cybersecurity breach. The things we've got with the fraud as well is quite often we can have a knock-on effect, where we actually have the mass data breaches which may come in from another site. We can actually have the reuse of those credentials in there. We've got authentication. How are we going to authenticate? How are they bypassing that? We've got the regulations. We've just had the legal side. We've been talking about the PSD2. We've had faster payments come in the UK, elsewhere in the globe, and I've got a slide around that. With PSD2, we're now opening up banking systems. We've got the AISP and the PISP, so the aggregators, the payment facilities there. What does that mean? It's an extension of trust, or is it actually an extension of risk? As I said, I work for a behavioural biometrics company. I'm not going to go on about it, but interesting from a show of hands, how many people actually are aware of behavioural biometrics? So I'm seeing probably about 8 to 10 hands. And it's interesting, it shows how the banking sector has gone on it first. The UK banks have actually been using it for the last 6 years. Very much in the background, not talked about. At the biometrics piece yesterday, I didn't hear mention of it at all. It's very much the hard biometrics. But when we consider multimodality now, what we're seeing in the best of breed is that you're actually combining some of the physical biometrics with behaviour. So things where you've got fingerprint spoofing or even face spoofing, you can actually now put that with behaviour behind it, and you're actually getting multiple layers of things and multiple layers of controls. You can give the continuous authentication. So on this, I'm looking at the peer-to-peer payments, which are really being driven in the US there. Some of that is because they don't have faster payments there yet. We've also got the third-party payment providers, which are then coming in from the PSD2 piece. I think that they're analogous. We're looking at it. Both of them are actually piggybacking off an existing banking infrastructure. We don't reinvent the wheel. People trust the banking sector, and things work. What's interesting on the TPPs is working with the banks across EMEA there, I'm seeing that actually the banks themselves are now becoming some of the biggest AISPs, so the account aggregation. They're saying when you log into digital banking, whether it's on the mobile, whether it's on the web, whether it's an entirely new digital platform on the mobile or the tablet, they're saying you log into Bank A, but you're seeing everything from banks B, C, D and E, even cross-border now because of what's going on with PSD2. The other interesting thing is some of the early adopters we're seeing, both in terms of the companies actually providing these services, but the people using it are not representative of what looks to be the longer term. Certainly on the peer-to-peers, we've had the millennials using it. But actually in the US, it's becoming more mature. Within EMEA, it's quite often used for payments, for buying stuff like eBay, etc. We've got a much wider demographic. The other thing that's interesting from a fraud and risk perspective is that we've got a success criteria, and whoever is launching anything in this space, they need to actually get the people behind it to make it profitable. And quite often the fraud controls were not put in the early stages there. You've actually almost got to get to a critical mass before you get fraud, and before you get fraud you can't actually justify any controls. So we actually see that something goes, starts ramping up, and then you get a bubble and you get a bust-out fraud on there. The other thing I found from actually dealing with the digital owners is that actually you've got to have this trust with what's actually going on the digital platform there. And it's now very much around the concept of security theatre is gone. We go back 10 years ago for adoption for digital banking. It was, I needed a hard token. I needed to see something to trust that channel. What we're now seeing is actually there should be a very, very light touch. Most of the banks I'm working with are actually saying we want to take away some of this hard auth. And this is actually almost at odds with what's coming out from the PSD2. Where they're going, I need to have actually dynamic authentication there. I need to tell you where it's going. I need to actually have strong customer authentication. And this is where the UK banks are being very, very clever. And they're going, actually, I want low friction. How can I use some of the newer technologies to actually still meet these regulatory standards and grow the digital channel? So let's go to the peer-to-peer first. I've just brought some figures down here. We look at the US, you know, that's going up. You know, you've got 50% of the people likely to use it in the next 3 years. What's driving it here? Well, really, they haven't got faster payments. It's looking like it's 2020 for the US to get faster payments. I've done a lot of work in the US when I was consulting, and I was shocked trying to get money from one US bank to another across state lines. 3 days, hassle, absolutely dreadful. This is why people have been using this. Quite often it's low values, so people like PayPal and Venmo and the rest of it have actually stepped into that gap. As I say, it's actually going beyond the millennials on there. Europe, when we look at peer-to-peer, we immediately think, you know, PayPal, etc. We have had actually some stuff in the UK. We've had PayM, and I am UK biased on there. This is my experience. PayM fed into faster payments in the UK. It was trying to make that peer-to-peer payment on there. It's just done nothing. I've got figures on there. It's quite interesting where people have gone out to third parties to do that instead. Instead, we're just seeing that the peer-to-peer in the UK isn't happening. People are now going into the mobile app, frictionless. They can make payments of £250 to someone they haven't paid before, no step-up authentication. The banks are relying on all the controls they've got. They're meeting the PSD2 requirements for low-value payments. The rest of the world's really interesting. Speaking with Africa a lot now, they have completely jumped over almost the web-based mobile banking, web-based banking. Straight to mobile, you've got smartphones. It's taking it to areas which weren't banked before. India's another really interesting one around that. We look at the transactions here, you know, we've got the US, and what I'm saying is actually how fast the payment is. We're actually the underlying piece there, where most of these are 3 days. Even in Europe, PayPal, when I use it, it's 3 days. And this actually leads us to a really risk-based conundrum. If you're running the channels, how do you actually go across this? How do you verify that it really is the person who's doing this? It's not an account takeover. They've not added an account they don't actually own. But we look at the values there. PayPal dominates on that. Zelle's an interesting one because that's actually run by the banks behind it. It's the way they're trying to get round that payments person to person over there. They're laying it on top. We got Facebook. I don't even know anyone who actually used the Facebook Messenger payments. But to actually then get an idea of the figures, you know, faster payments in the UK, 419 billion, and the others are kind of double digit or 100 plus million there. So it shows the value of the different payment systems. What are we seeing with problems on the peer-to-peer? Well, a lot of the peer-to-peer, you're actually buying goods. They're still coming in there. It's someone you don't know, so you've got 2 parties who don't know each other. You're trying to find some form of trust broker. So someone may be sending a ticket. The victim then receives $200 or £200 or 200 euros. They've got the money. It's gone into their peer-to-peer app. They release the goods. But actually, we've got a fraudster who's done an account takeover. That's on a different device. They've registered it there on the app. They've got past all the validation there, the authentication. And then we've actually got the fact that, really, it's that 3-day window which is being abused. We've got the fact that you've got the money, it says in your peer-to-peer that you've got your $200 there. But actually it's only day plus one or even day plus two that actually the peer-to-peer provider is realizing that things have been taken over there. And actually, in some of the US ones there, when we actually look at Venmo and even Zelle, you're not meant to use this for the purchase of for products. It's actually meant to be just, you're paying people you'll know. But it's almost the fact that they haven't got the ability to pay for these in any other manner. They're using it, they're abusing the system, and they're being left out. The other thing we've got, and it comes back to the human aspect, and I'll touch on this later, is people are used to the ping that comes up on the device. You've got $200. You're not looking further than that alert that just pings up. You've got your money. I'm happy. You don't know what's going on behind it. You're trying to trust that brand, or you do trust the brand you're using. And really what we've seen on this is actually, when you look at the fraud perspective and the peer-to-peer, it's not actually monitoring the day-to-day of the peer-to-peer account. It's when you actually register a new device for it. This is the pain point on there. So when we look at a new registration of an app, so this is digital banking on the mobile, which is completely applicable, peer-to-peer, the fintechs as well, variety of other things. This is the pain point. This is the point at which we're not always giving the focus we need. Now, the traditional controls, we go, right, what's the IP? Is it a new device that's actually on there? Is it a known bad device? There's some very good companies doing all the device profiling around this. Have we got any technical risk? Has it been jailbroken? Has it been rooted? Similar to that. And that's worked pretty well. The problem is now with greater privacy, we're coming back to things like GDPR. We've got Apple in particular is putting in some very strong things around how much you can actually track the person and their device. This is starting to break. The IP on mobile, it's going to be off a mobile network. You're not even going back to normally a home location. We've got authentication. So we've got static, so we've got the username and password. So you've got mass data breach, those can be reused. You can take it where you've had your email or a mom and pop e-commerce site which actually hacked. You're using the same password for your peer-to-peer. We've got knowledge-based authentication. That's great, apart from we've had hacks, breaches, and people getting into things like Equifax on there, so they know more about you and they have the data to hand more than you do. We've got SMS. Oh, goes to the mobile. Yeah, we've got SIM swap. We've seen that. Big problem goes through there. You're then reliant on the telco security measures for what's actually going on. What we've been doing is looking at the behavioural biometrics, working with people where instead of looking at the device and the physical, you're actually looking behind it, and you get some very, very interesting stuff behind that. One, you've got the population level. So you go, where are the outliers with what's actually going on there? And you can pick stuff up which the technical may not do. You're able to actually pick up the fact that this could actually be a virtualized or an emulated device. Now, I know there's a lot of other things you can do on the technical side, but actually you can start going through and you can pick up some very discrete traits on there to spot that. But the key thing, and this is where the traditional authentication versus almost continuous authentication, where you look at the behavior behind the device, if you've got a pattern and that user has been using your system in the past, you can go, does this person who's now registering actually look like person A who is the real one? So you can actually pull up behind the device what's going on. This is being found to be very, very powerful on there. So, faster payments. When I actually laid all of this out for my original webinar, I hadn't realised how few countries have proper faster payments. I come from the UK. I was in the Royal Bank of Scotland when faster payments came in. I've got a little bit more anecdotes around that. But when that came in, it was nicknamed faster fraud. Whenever you get a faster payments going into a country, your fraud level will spike. The fraudsters will find holes in your existing systems which are built around, T+1, T+2, T+3. Things I find interesting is Japan actually had faster payments back in 1973, which is, quite amazing when you actually go back and consider the technology they had there. US is going to be the big one when that comes in 2020. And you've got the same technology behind it, which is in the UK. The most recent one that's gone live is Australia. They've done more of a soft launch. They're working with my Australian colleagues. The fraud levels have gone up, but they're not spiked as much. They've learnt from the UK. The UK was actually quite interesting. You could have a faster payment limit of £10,000 initially, but it was the fact that not all banks did that equally. I worked for a bank that put £10,000 in. Our fraud levels and attempted went like that. The other banks got clever and went, we're putting a £100 limit in. Guess who learned from our mistakes? We've got strong customer authentication, the SCA from PSD2. That's coming in from next year.
Ladies and gentlemen, we remind you that the keynote session will start at 12 in the conference room 1. You are welcome to attend.
Yeah, but you're also welcome to stay a little more, at least till 12:15, I guess. We'll end up around that.
Okay, so we've got the requirements there. We've got to strongly authenticate every 90 days. For a lot of banks, the strong authentication is typically only being done at the payment stage. So what do you do if someone hasn't made a payment in 90 days? So they've got questions around that. The other thing that the banks are doing as I'm speaking with them is, well, we've got strong customer authentication, particularly the dynamic linking. So where you're actually passing back to the customer, who are you paying, what are you paying, what's the name you're paying, what's the validation there? Are you going to use that actually at the logon with that requirement, or are you going to do something else on there? What's the user experience? Are the new paradigms coming in? What we're seeing is actually with the lower friction, we're seeing a combination of very, very strong device binding and behavior being used as one of the ways to actually give that lower customer friction and do it. So it's almost a covert strong customer authentication rather than the overt, and actually saying that because we're in a low risk environment, that the banks are not putting dynamic authentication in because they can say it is low risk. Really interesting slide here. You know, we're a conference where we're talking about authentication and the value of it. So we had faster payments going in 2008. I was in the banking sector, or been in the banking sector for most of this. That is where strong authentication went in. As you can see, strong authentication, as mandated by the European Banking Association, really works to prevent fraud, doesn't it? So it dropped it down on there. And this is when the banks in the UK were putting in card and reader. They were doing the dynamic transaction linking then. It didn't do much stuff. What we're finding, 100% of digital fraud is now occurring in strongly authenticated sessions. And that's a really interesting point when you look at it. We then had anti-malware go in. And it's always an arms race when you're dealing with this. And I think what we're seeing now is there's no silver bullet. We have to put layers of controls on top of it. We then had device go in. You know, these made, you know, a pretty big dent, but then we had changes which went on. That's where behavioural biometrics started going in the UK there. You know, went in with the first couple of banks. We've got the other two of the main ones coming in, other ones next year. But I'll say there, yeah, strong authentication as mandated by PSD2 really works. Really, this is my takeaway. What I've seen is that we're in an arms race, effectively. For each thing the attacker puts in, we've got to counter it, and they're always stronger and faster than us. The bad guys don't have change control so much. We started off with the attack social engineering, the phishing, the money mules. So we went, well, here's two-factor, and it got round that. Then we had all the technical and the malware, which is put in there to actually get round that strong authentication. So they were capturing the credentials, you know, within the session. We had man in the browser, man in the middle. We've had remote access Trojans. Those were to get around device profiling. They were coming off your machine, but it was the bad guy coming in. With the SMS, we had the SMS redirection, we had SIM swap and the rest of it. We've now got the fact that in the UK, we're back to social engineering. The losses from scams where you're rung up by someone pretending to be the bank and you make the payments with your strong authentication are actually probably 1 3/4 time that of the third-party losses. So we're back to this. We've got cross-channel frauds. We've got the other scams there. We've got the CEO, CFO ones coming in. We've got romance scams. The mass data breaches, the reuse of it is there. What the banks are doing now is they are merging all these different layers of controls. They're keeping most of the existing ones. So they've got risk engines which can actually take it in. They're getting big data coming into it. They're putting device, they're putting behavior, they're putting the transaction in there. But the key thing is, rather than just spotting the fraudsters, they're now going, how can we find that 95, 96% of sessions which really look like the genuine customer? Running it straight through, meeting all the requirements of PSD2, GDPR, but actually for the genuine customer, there's a lot more focus on that to actually move in and do that. The account opening and registration is something where they're now looking end-to-end, cradle to grave, comes back to that registration of the devices there. And really the best of them are going, we need low customer friction. We can't put all of this high friction in there. It just doesn't work. We can't get people who are certainly not digital natives running the systems. How do we actually get people in the grey pound, the 60 plus, using the systems as we're all moving to it? A few little quotes at the end there. I think I've done that on time. And thank you very much for your attendance, and I hope you found it interesting.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Ian. And now for the final talk, we're going to actually try to land on Saturn. Also understand. With us, I'd like to call Mr. Anders Rundgren. Sorry if I don't pronounce correctly. Mr. You are.
Hello.
Hello. Mr. Rundgren is a seasoned technologist, inventor, and entrepreneur working with internet-related products and solutions. For the last 15 years, Mr. Rundgren has been focusing on security, including a stint at the office of the CTO of RSA Security. And nowadays, Mr. Rundgren is working as an independent consultant inventor under the name webpki.org. He's also active with the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, a 30-year-old open standards organization operating under the auspices of the Internet Society, and which develops and promotes voluntary Internet standards, and where he's currently developing a clear text JSON-based signature standard together with Microsoft. And so I believe we are going to discuss about Saturn.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. That was a lot. Okay, I am going to describe something called Saturn here, which is an open, decentralized payment authorization system. This presentation will be a little bit more technical than usual, and it is also made by an engineer. It means that the slides are slightly ugly as well, but I hope you can bear with me. No, I need a shifter here. Okay, sorry. Oops. Minor mistakes here. Okay. Yep. Okay. Where does the inspiration come from? It is actually from Scandinavia. I am Swedish, although I'm living in France. In Scandinavia, the different countries have established very successful mobile payment systems. It would be very interesting to compare them. There is just one snag. They are all proprietary and they are secret. One of the differences here between the Saturn and these efforts is that it is open. What does open mean? It means that everything from code, specification, and even test applications, like a client that you can download from Android, Google Play Store, is available. You probably wonder what kind of technology is inside of this system. And it could be something like FIDO authentication, it could build on open banking, or it could be blockchain, but actually it doesn't do any of those. It builds on the very old card-based system. Why bother with such a boring system, you may wonder? Because, okay, it's old, but it can still be improved. And in this case, I would say it is, we can call it a technology refresh of the card-based system, so it can do more. In the card system, you have a card number. This card number indicates which is the issuer, the financial institution, your account, brand, etc. In order to use this in a scalable version, merchants are usually connected to a third party that does the heavy lifting as well as having the contacts with the bank. One of the functions it does is looking up the card number in order to find out the institution to interact with. From the beginning, it was just a card number. Then, with EMV standard, a signature key was added. This greatly improves security, because now you have an authenticated key. That means you digitally sign your transactions or your authorization. That's very good. Unfortunately, as we know, in the online world, things are not equally good because the signature key is usually not available. I'm sorry about the animations, they're a little bit ridiculous, but I don't care about that. Now, with Saturn, I introduce a new kind of credential, a credential that tries to to achieve decentralization, which is the interesting thing here. This is very technical. I will just go very short over some things. One of the biggest differences is that we add a link, a URL, web address inside of the credential. That link points directly to the issuer bank. Then you can see an account number. This is a SEPA IBAN number. It means that this system is not limited to card networks like Visa or MasterCard. It can be used for any kind of account-based system. But of course it has a signature key. That is invaluable. What's happening now is, since we have a URL pointing directly to the bank, we don't need the lookup database anymore. So effectively, it removes the need for having an intermediary. Probably say, well, hold on a bit, this is dangerous. You mean the merchant is directly talking to the issuer bank? It could be a merchant that is completely unknown by the bank. And that is actually what it does. And how that can be secure, it will be slides further away. As you know, card numbers can be reused, and that's not good. So the industry introduced tokenization to make card authorizations only work one time. That's a very good idea. It has not caught on very much. It's still a rather marginal activity. Naturally, a system that points to the future must also have some kind of tokenization system. One of the problems when you add a new service is to find a business model. In Saturn, this is very simple. The issuer has not only deployed a signature key, which you can authorize data with, it also deploys an encryption key, making it possible to first you sign the transaction, the request, and then you encrypt it. It means that you can pass the block to the merchant, which will not see anything. It will not see any account numbers. It is just a binary blob. This is also a privacy-enhancing scheme because you don't want to leave unnecessarily digital traces. So, with this very simple system, we removed the tokenization service from the picture. Okay, we have now briefly looked on the inside. Now we can take a look on the outside. This is sort of the current standard. You have an EMV card, you have a trusted protocol between the card and a terminal, payment terminal, which in turn then talks to merchant systems and other systems. I wrote trusted card protocol. That means that it is only secure if the terminal itself is secure. That is one of the limitations of this system. That is why the EMV card never worked on the web, because on the web you have transiently downloaded code. You cannot say if it's secure or not, or trustworthy. That's a huge limitation. In the system Saturn uses, we have something called Personal Payment Terminal, which integrates these functions into one unit. It offers some very obvious features, like that it is adapted to your language, which is good. It is also adapted to your disability. It means that, for instance, you can look on the terminal like this, which is pretty good for an aging population, including myself. Other things, of course, are completely evident, that you must have some kind of card logo. It's good for the user, but also for the issuer, who would like to see his brand exposed as often as possible, I guess. Then we have things that are not standard for card-based system, finding out the current status of the account, which is pretty useful. Can I really afford to make this purchase? Maybe not. And that is something clearly missing from the card world. UI is adapted for what kind of transaction you actually do. sometimes you just do a payment, sometimes you do a booking. But when you go to a gas station, you do something completely different. You reserve maybe 200 euros or something like that, but you will only be charged for a smaller amount, or the amount you needed for fill up the car. So the UI is adapted. And from security point of view, which is why we are here, keys must be stored in a secure way, and trusted execution keys is trusted execution environment is sort of the lower bar here for key storage. Then we come to what we have here, high level. Here we have a line with a lot of bullshit, it looks like. High level. Well, high level is things like showing what kind of transaction you have. That's rather high level. End-to-end secured. Well, in the previous slide, there was a key that signed the authorization that went all the way back to the bank. That's an end-to-end secured solution. What an end-to-end secured solution also means that there is no work for any intermediary. You can't do anything. It's like a secure tube all the way to the bank. This is why a system like this is essentially shuts out players like Google or Apple. They can't really handle a system like this. They have nothing to offer. Okay, what happened with such a system is that you don't need cards, and the traditional payment terminal does go away. There is one word there as well, that's interesting, 360-degree. What does it mean? It's not my idea, it's the Norwegians that call their WIPS system a 360-degree payment system. That means you can use it everywhere, online, in the shop, etc. The same protocol, exactly the same protocol. That means we're not talking EMV protocol. EMV protocol were not designed for the web. They were designed to be used in this environment, which is extremely different. So here we have a really high-level security protocol. Okay, now we come to security here. Doesn't this introduce risk? Well, in order to do anything interesting from the outside, you must introduce some kind of hole. Of course, Saturn introduces a hole in the fence. But it's not all that bad. The security hole, that means the space of attack, is very small compared to standard online banking. When you log in with online banking, you have access to all services. You can send money, you can do whatever you want. Open banking is a little bit similar. You expose quite a bit of the bank functionality inside of the API. With Saturn, you have a very limited functionality. You just take one transaction to a specific account, and that's all it does. There was one thing that I mentioned on the first more technical slide, that how could an unknown merchant talk securely to a user's bank? That is not obvious, but that is one of the core things in Saturn. The traditional security model for banks is called four-corner, where each client interacts with his own bank and performs operations to other banks. And this is a very good security model, but now we have merchants and users on different banks, and we are in a different scenario, and letting everything go through the merchant's bank, for instance, that would be very impractical. It's technically possible, but it's not a very good idea. So we want to create a secure messaging from an unknown merchant to the user's bank, because it's the merchant that want to suck out the money based on the user's authorization of the transaction. How do you do that? Well, the merchant must in some way be recognized as being a part of a network. And here we add a lot of things, interesting things. Each merchant must have a unique key. That is just a blank key. It doesn't say anything about what it is. but that means that everything that it requests, like payments, is signed with this key. The merchant's bank and the user's bank, they are supposed to be inside of a PKI, a trust network. That means they have a certificate. For each merchant, the merchant bank signs a piece of information and publishes it on the internet, completely public, that binds the merchant's key to the merchant's bank, so it vouches for the merchant's identity. That is the way this can scale. So you don't need a specific service provider. The merchant bank can do this simple thing itself. That means that the user bank can look up, aha, here comes a payment request. It is signed, authorized by one of our customers, and it is requested by a merchant which belongs to one of our banks in our trust network. This is the way security is dealt with in Saturn, very briefly. It's a little bit more complex when you look on it, but this is everything that is suitable for this day, at least. And that was essentially it. And I am here, so you can talk to me if you want. I will be the whole day and a bit tomorrow.